The reel was never cataloged. No leader strip, no frame count, no cue marks. Just a dented canister with no return address. The metal smelled faintly of vinegar, the kind that seeps from acetate when it begins to die. Someone had handled it too often. The fingerprints were still there, embedded in dust. I didn't intend to watch it, but the handwritten note, folded into quarters, tucked inside, had a weight I couldn't ignore. 2 words, not listed. It was shot in 1971. That much I could tell before the projector lamp even warmed. The uniforms were summer fatigues, creased in a way that suggested they were new from supply, not yet dirtied by field work. The room they sat in was too quiet for a barracks. No chatter, no clatter of trays, just folding chairs, a plywood table, and the soft hum of an air handler you could almost feel in your teeth. 12 men, all under 30, each with a paper cup of water, each looking at the same fixed point, somewhere behind the camera. It wasn't a briefing. It wasn't an interrogation. It was something slower, stranger, as if they had been told to simply wait and that the waiting itself was the test. The footage had no sound. But every now and then, one of the men would speak, lips moving deliberately, as though repeating a phrase they had memorized. No laughter, no deviation, the same cadence over and over. I froze the frame, traced the outline of their name tapes. 2 matched a roster from Fort Detrick's testing division. One was listed as administrative support. No MOS, no deployment history. The rest? Not found. Not in payroll, not in casualty lists, not in the veterans database. Frame 211. A man reaches for his cup, but his hand stops halfway. Not hesitation, more like a signal interrupted. He waits, then lowers it again. The man next to him mirrors the movement exactly, 3 seconds later. In the margins of the frame, there's a black clipboard and the faintest reflection of a wristwatch. The kind issued to medical staff, not field units. At first, I thought it was just observation. The military had done stranger group endurance tests, but then, at frame 446, a shape enters the room. White coat, mask carrying a vial so small it barely registers on film. The soldiers don't look at him, they look through him. Eyes fixed, breathing even. He drops one clear tablet into each cup. No reaction, no words exchanged. When they drink, it's in perfect unison. The muscles in their necks tighten at the same time, as if their bodies have been trained to respond on a shared signal. There's a cut here, a splice so abrupt it lifts the frame out of sequence. The light changes. The chairs are gone. They're standing now, hands pressed to the wall, faces turned away from the camera. It's the floor that caught me. Scuffed linoleum, but with faint stenciled numbers. Room coordinates used in old chemical storage sites. The same ones decommissioned after the Edgewood trials were exposed. Officially, those tests ended in 1970. Officially. The men are sweating now. Some tap their fingers in sets of 4 against the wall. Others hum without opening their mouths. The room seems louder, though the film is silent. One man collapses, not violently, but slowly, as though gravity had simply asked more of him than he could give. Cut. Now they're back at the table. Paper cups gone. A chalkboard in the background reads, Phase 3B. On the edge of the frame, a gloved hand writes a number, erases it, writes it again. I checked every available record. No Phase 3B exists in any Department of Defense trials for that year. No memo, no budget allocation, no safety report. But I did find something else. A memo from the Army Surgeon General's office, stamped January 5th, 1972, detailing temporary reassignment of select volunteers to civilian oversight facilities. The location column was left blank. Back to the reel. Frame 902. They're seated in the dark. Only a metronome arm swings in the corner. A shadow crosses the lens. Broad shoulders, hair close cropped. Someone checking their pupils with a pen light. One soldier blinks out of sequence. He doesn't make the next movement the others do. 2 frames later, he's gone. The gap in the lineup is not addressed. The others continue as if he had never been there. The splice tape along the reel edge is old, yellowed, curling slightly, meaning it's been handled more than once. Someone had watched this before. Someone had chosen which parts to keep. I found no follow-up records, but I found a shipment log, dated March 9th, 1971, from Aberdeen Proving Ground to a storage annex in St. Louis, Missouri. The manifest listed 1 16mm film canister, no description. 14 personal effects bags. 2 crates labeled glass, handle carefully. All signed by the same man, Captain L. MIRE. No rank after 1973. I tried to track the names again. 2 of the soldiers appeared briefly in a 1974 base newsletter, smiling beside a new medical wing in Texas. After that, nothing. Not even a death notice. The ones I could not find were harder to let go. The gaps in the archive were too precise, as if absence itself was part of the design. I watched the reel again, this time, looking not at the men, but at the edges of the frame. At the faint shadow lines on the wall, the way the light shifted from right to left, as though the source wasn't overhead, but moving. Frame 1301. The camera pans. The only time it moves. It lingers on a doorway in the back corner, half open, light spilling through like a separate film playing behind it. Then the reel ends. No leader, no fade. Just the click of the last frame. I rewound it slowly, feeling the uneven tension of the splice points. I marked every cut, every frame where the light didn't match, every moment where a man's hand was in a different position from one frame to the next. The gaps made a second sequence, a pattern of absences, too deliberate to be chance. When I arranged the missing numbers, they matched a set of coordinate points used in internal medical routing forms. One of them, just one, matched a now empty wing of a VA hospital in Maryland. A wing sealed in 1972 after an infrastructure issue that never made the papers. The film wasn't just a record, it was a map. And if the map was real, then so were the men. Even if no one wanted to admit they'd ever existed at all. The VA wing was locked behind 3 layers of rust and 1 fresh padlock. No signage, no hazard warnings, just a faint outline on the brick where a building number used to hang. Inside, the air was heavier than abandonment should allow. Tiles buckled where steam pipes had ruptured years ago. The smell of paper lived in the walls, even though no shelves remained. In the farthest room, the linoleum bore the same stenciled coordinates from the reel, faded now, but still legible in the light from a cracked window. Against the back wall, 4 metal gurneys stood in a line, stripped bare. No sheets, no tags. Just a ring of rust where the casters had bled into the floor. Someone had painted over a section of the cinder block. The gray was newer, not yet yellowed like the rest. A handprint lingered beneath the paint, raised by the brushstrokes but never erased. I pulled records for the hospital's maintenance contracts. The sealed wing didn't appear on any of them. No heating, no inspections, nothing to suggest it had ever existed. But a single requisition order from 1971 listed controlled environment retrofits, with no specifications. The contractor's name was a shell company used in 2 other Army medical research projects that year, both related to chemical agents whose test subjects could not be relocated. The pattern was no longer subtle. It was the same 4 or 5 names, circling the same facilities, never in print longer than a fiscal quarter. I kept tracing CPTL MIRE. After 1973, he surfaced once in a civilian medical journal, co-authoring a piece on neurochemical latency thresholds, a phrase too exact to be harmless. The other author was listed simply as R. Ellison, Ph.D. That name belonged to a researcher who, according to Army correspondence, had declined permanent clearance and disappeared into civilian practice in upstate New York. But Ellison's clinic closed in 1975 after a patient was found wandering 10 miles from the facility, unable to recall her own name. No charges, no headlines. I compared the patient's intake description to the soldiers in the reel: height, age, blood type. They matched one almost exactly, except now the subject was listed as female. That's when I noticed it in the film. Frame 683. A soldier's wrist is visible beneath his cuff. There's a faint surgical scar along the ulna, fresh enough to still hold a pink edge. The same scar was in the patient, photo from 1975, though now the skin around it was paler, as if circulation had been compromised. Whatever the test was, it wasn't about endurance. It was about transfer. Not of rank or records, but of something that could inhabit another body. The reel's Phase 3B looked less like training and more like calibration. I went back to the shipment log. 14 personal effects bags, only 12 soldiers visible on film, 2 unaccounted for, or already processed. The crates marked glass, handle carefully, were harder to trace. But one Army supply manifest from 1972 listed a transfer of closed system chemical dispersal apparatus to a classified address in Utah. When I cross-referenced the address, it mapped to a building now leased to a private biomedical company. Its board stacked with former defense contractors. In a 1984 patent filing under that company's name, I found an image, a clear vial, ribbed cap, and a slow-release suspension medium. The patent claimed it was for targeted delivery of therapeutic compounds. The model number on the filing was identical to one briefly visible in the reel's frame 452, when the masked technician leans over the table. No one patents military delivery systems for civilian therapies unless the origin is impossible to prove. The deeper I went, the more the film seemed like an artifact of an in-between phase, a place where protocol met improvisation before the language was sanitized and the record made official. I built a timeline. 1969. Edgewood Arsenal officially halts field volunteer chemical tests. 1970. Internal memos shift to behavioral observation trials. 1971. The reel is filmed. Shipment to St. Louis occurs. 1972. VA wing sealed. Phase 3B designation appears in internal notes. 1973. MIRE's trail ends in public records. 1974 to 75. Civilian cases emerge matching soldier profiles. 1976 onward. All related company filings cite therapeutic innovation. The term volunteer never appeared after 1971. The subjects were simply participants. I thought about the missing sound. Why strip the audio unless it carried something more dangerous than the images? A phrase? A frequency? Audio in that era could carry subliminals, pulse tones, or cues meant to trigger conditioned responses. If the soldiers moved in unison, it might not have been obedience. It could have been resonance. In a box of unrelated training reels from the same base, I found one with a burn mark in the corner, a flaw that matched a speck in the soldier's film. Same camera, same operator. The second reel showed nothing but a room with a strobe lamp firing at irregular intervals. In the corner, a metronome arm ticked without sound. The operator had spliced leader tape in sets of 3 feet, a technique used for sync marking with an audio track. If the soldier reel had an audio twin, it had been separated long before I found it. But there was one last frame I hadn't noticed. After the supposed end, a few millimeters of emulsion still wound past the gate. A partial exposure of what looked like a man's face, half in shadow. No uniform. Just a slight tilt of the head and a blurred shape near his mouth that could have been a microphone. It made the reel feel less like surveillance and more like documentation for an internal audience. Not proof for outsiders, but memory for those inside the system, so they could recall what had been done and to whom. I checked the VA wing one last time. Behind the gurney, someone had scratched numbers into the wall paint. 6 digits. The first 3 matched a storage code used by the National Archives for classified medical material. The second set pointed to a subseries that had been retired without accession, meaning it had been destroyed or stored somewhere off the books. The coordinates from the reel and the code on the wall overlapped by a single digit. I could feel the edges of the pattern, like static before a signal locks. The soldiers, the hospital wing, the company patents, the shipment log, all parts of a circuit that had been cut and rerouted, so no one could see the whole design, except the reel. The reel didn't lie. It only waited. I didn't return the reel to its box. It sat on my desk for weeks, the canister leaving a faint ring on the wood, as if the weight of it was trying to sink through and find the floor beneath. Every attempt to trace the coordinates ended in the same reply. No record found. Not denied. Not classified. Just absence, the most deliberate form of classification there is. Absence meant the file had been removed at the source. Not shredded. Not lost. Lifted out clean, leaving no ragged edge to suggest it had ever been there. I began to understand the design. The program didn't end in 1971. It went silent. And silence is harder to track than noise. In a series of Army medical conference notes from the late 1970s, there are repeated references to phase-adjacent civilian metrics. No context, no authorship. But in the index of attendees, a name appeared that I hadn't seen in years. L. Myron. Now listed without rank, without department, just consultant. The entry fee for that conference was billed to a defense subcontractor specializing in biointegration systems. Their founding documents were signed by R. Ellison. I returned to the patent images from 1984. The vials were almost identical to those in the reel, except for one change. In the patent, the suspension medium was tinted amber, likely to protect whatever was inside from light. On the film, the liquid was perfectly clear. Clear because it didn't need protection. Clear because its half-life was measured in minutes, not years. Its purpose was not storage. It was transfer. The patient from 1975 had lived another decade. When she died, her obituary listed no surviving family, but her effects were sent to an unmarked facility in Virginia, the same facility that received material samples from 3 military hospitals in the early 1970s. The manifest language was always the same: bioretention units. Not bodies, not remains, units. That was the word that made it final for me. The reel didn't show soldiers being tested. It showed units being calibrated. The uniforms were costume. The names were placeholders. Whatever they were building wasn't meant to serve. It was meant to persist. The missing audio, the unison movements, the gaps in the line, they were all symptoms of the same process. Something installed, tested, and transferred until it could survive without the host. I no longer believed the men had simply vanished. Their identities had been overwritten, not erased, repurposed. The VA wing was not a hospital. It was a holding site between transfers. The gurneys were not for treatment. They were for containment. One of the scratched numbers on the wall was not a storage code at all. It was a date, 12 years after the reel was shot. I found an incident report from that day, a ventilation malfunction in a private biomedical lab in Utah. No casualties reported, no evacuation ordered, but 3 employees were reassigned without notice, and their positions filled by staff on loan from the Department of Defense. 2 of those staff shared blood types with soldiers from the reel. The third matched the patient from 1975. The circuit had closed, not geographically, not institutionally, but biologically. The film was the only place they still existed as themselves. Every other record, every other appearance was a reissue. The same internal architecture housed in a different frame. I stopped looking for their names after that. The moment you recognize the pattern, you start to see it everywhere. Faces that don't change between decades, gait and posture that outlast injury, speech that holds the same pauses despite different voices. The institution had learned the cost of open testing. After Edgewood, after the hearings, they understood the danger was not in the work itself, but in its visibility. So they buried the work in plain sight. The soldiers in the reel were not volunteers. They were the first stable carriers, and stability is the only true clearance. I could have destroyed the film. It would have been easy. Acetate burns hot, and once it starts, there's nothing left but ash. But destruction is another kind of silence, and I had learned that silence is the most dangerous thing in the archive. So I stored it in a place without a record. No catalog entry, no accession number. If someone found it by accident, it would only be because they were already looking. I didn't write a report. I didn't file a summary. The reel had survived 50 years without being seen. It could survive longer without my annotation. I think about the half-exposed face at the very end of the film, the tilt of the head, the blurred microphone. A technician, an observer, or another carrier, watching the next units come online? I will never know. Not because the answers aren't there, but because every path that leads to them is designed to fold back into the institution. There is no whistle to blow, no headline to print. Just a reel of silent faces, a set of coordinates that point to rooms now empty, and the certainty that absence is never an accident. Somewhere, in a facility without a name, the pattern continues. New carriers calibrated, old ones transferred. The circuit maintained without interruption. And in a locked drawer, under 3 layers of unmarked envelopes, the reel waits. Its light and shadow unchanging. Its silence holding more than the film stock should allow. If you ever see it, you will know. Not because you recognize the faces, but because they will recognize you.